Hello and welcome to BBC News. I'm Martine Croxall. Officials in Ukraine say at least 35 people have been killed and more than 130 others wounded in a Russian missile attack on a military base in the west of the country, a short drive from the Polish border. The attack, which took place in the far west of Ukraine, hit the military training base Yavoriv. The base was previously used for joint exercises and training with NATO. The attack on the base is part of a widening of Russian advances towards the west of Ukraine on the doorstep of a NATO member and away from the areas which Russian forces currently control, shown here in red. While Russia's invasion force has advanced towards several Ukrainian cities, with more intense fighting reported in the northern outskirts of the capital, Kyiv. Let's hear more now from James Waterhouse, who gave us this update about the attack on the military base.
This is an air base, a military base, which has previously been used by NATO instructors on international forces, including Ukraine's own army. We have to say, though, that until this point, NATO, the alliance, has shown very little appetite to get involved in this war. Their argument has long been that they don't want an escalation, they don't want things to turn into a much broader conflict across Europe. But today we've had Poland's president, Andrzej Duda, claim he thinks things could be reconsidered if Vladimir Putin used chemical weapons on the Ukrainian people. But what today I think really represents is a much more of a broadening of the conflict within the borders of Ukraine. It's been a difficult decision, as it is, for people to up sticks and move, and for the 2.5 million people to move west to cities like Lviv before moving on to bordering countries. Now there is even less of a guarantee that they'll be able to avoid the fighting on that perilous route in Lviv or beyond, given what we're seeing with these more targeted Russian airstrikes. President Zelensky has just given another address where he's talked about his priority for now, which is getting humanitarian aid into the besieged city of Mariupol in the southeast. It's currently a couple of hours drive away, so that's his priority now in another significant day in this conflict.
James Waterhouse. A US journalist has been killed in Ukraine. Brent Renaud was an award-winning filmmaker who'd previously worked for the New York Times but was not on assignment for the newspaper while he was in Ukraine. He died in Irpin after the car he was travelling in came under attack. Another journalist was wounded. He's thought to be the first journalist to die in this war. Carlos Martinez de la Serna is Programme Director for the Committee to Protect Journalists and joins us now. Carlos, thank you very much for joining us. It's incredibly sad news, a violation of international law, as your organisation has said. How clear are the circumstances of Mr. Renaud's death?
Thanks for having me. So according to, if I summarize what we know from news reports and testimony about this other journalist that was also wounded in the same attack, and the testimony of a Ukrainian police official, the journalists were crossing or passing through a checkpoint when they were attacked. During that attack, Brent Renaud was shot and killed, and the other journalist who also provided testimony was wounded. The other journalist is a Colombian U.S. photojournalist. What we know is as you said, what international humanitarian law says. Journalists are civilians in practical terms during war, during conflict. They're never legitimate targets, and targeting them directly amounts to a war crime.
We understand that Mr. Renaud was wearing a press badge to try to identify himself as a journalist. What sort of protections would you hope journalists would be afforded in a conflict zone?
So the same as civilians. As I said, they're never legitimate targets. All parties in the conflict should do everything they can to protect them. And again, I would reiterate this is essential. They're never legitimate targets. Targeting them, civilians, journalists as civilians, amounts to war crime. And journalists take all measures they can to prevent these attacks. They have badges, they study the dynamic of the war, the checkpoints, information, they identify themselves all the time. But the main responsibility is not on them, but on all parties to protect them.
Journalists are drawn to stories like this because they want to accurately reflect to the world what is really going on. And of course, with that, there is immense risk. What's your advice to journalists on how to report a story effectively, but try to stay safe?
Well, always planning is essential when you're reporting on anything, but mostly on a war and a conflict zone. So that means studying the terrain as much as possible, the dynamics of the war, which are always very fluid. According to reports, Ben Renaud was reporting within Irpin, in the outskirts of Kiev, with other journalists. According also to reports that I haven't confirmed myself, that city right now is probably will be banned for journalists. So the situation is all the time changing and evolving. They need to wear protective equipment when they can, and hopefully they always can in this situation. And as well, keep updating the information and studying the terrain and going with other journalists as well and colleagues to support each other. But again, sorry for emphasizing always the same. It's this case shows two things. One, that how journalists are willing to accept all risk, including the being exposed to major problems and challenges, to report the news and bring the news and work to the public. And second, it's other armies, other parties in the conflict who should do everything they can to protect them as well as civilians. And in this case, it clearly failed.
We're talking about this story because of this particular man, Brent Renaud. According to his personal website, he and his brother worked together. They received a Peabody Award for their work. They worked apparently in Iraq, Afghanistan and Libya, so they were used to working in very dangerous parts of the world. How much greater, though, is the risk to independent journalists who are not perhaps protected like one of the big news organisations, such as the BBC or CNN?
I wouldn't like really to speculate on that. Every journalist needs to be protected by both parties. But we can do is provide the best advice, safety equipment, safety practical information to every journalist, regardless of who's supporting them or who's behind them, so they can prevent as much as possible major problems or mitigate them. It's always, they all need the same type of information. They all need to be working with others, not alone, to support each other. And they are all facing major challenges and threats in a conflict zone like it is right now, Ukraine. Carlos
Martinez de la Sena from the Committee to Protect Journalists. Thank you very much for talking to us.
Thank you.
Air raid sirens have sounded again in the capital Kiev as fighting continues on its outskirts. Russian forces are thought to be less than 10 miles away in places. Our international correspondent Ola Gerin reports with the latest from Kiev.
Casualties of Europe's newest war. Ukrainian soldiers wounded this morning in battlefields on the outskirts of Kiev. His wounds are painful, not life-threatening, but the losses here are growing. Ukraine says about 1,300 of its soldiers have been killed. Sergei shows me his country's coat of arms, always close to his heart. He was a farmer before Russia invaded. Now, minus a few fingers, he intends to go straight back to the fight. The Russians will not take Kyiv, he says. If they take it, they will have to raze it to the ground. We are ready to fight until victory. And from his hospital bed, he thanks Boris Johnson and Britain, which he says is helping Ukraine a lot. And close to Kyiv today, Ukrainian police confirmed the killing of an American journalist. He was shot in the head by the Russians, the officer says. The award-winning filmmaker Brent Renaud was travelling in a car with other journalists when they came under fire. He had been documenting civilians fleeing from the town of Irpin. Inside Kyiv, what may be the calm before the storm. The streets are ready for battle, and so are many of the residents. Behind every tree, Molotov cocktails. Well, this is a very normal neighbourhood in Kyiv, and here's what you have here now. The shell of a bus being used as a barricade, sandbags, a gas canister. All of this has been brought here by local people to defend their own streets. They say they don't believe the Russians will get this far, but they intend to be ready just in case. Yuri abandoned his business to take up a gun.
And I wanted to say to all the Russians that all the streets, all these houses, entrances, roofs, basement will be obstacle, will be ambush for them. And Kyiv will be the total cemetery for them. Only thing they'll receive, it will be the mass grave for them.
Fighting street by street would mean heavy losses for both sides. But Russia has other options. It could bomb this city from the outside. Orla Guerin, BBC News, Kyiv.
Well, a little earlier, I spoke to Hanna Hopko, former chair of the Ukrainian Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. She's now lobbying Western governments for support. I asked her for her priorities.
To receive maximum military assistance immediately. And of course, we are also lobbying no-fly zone or even the freedom breach to provide military and humanitarian assistance aid to Western Ukraine. And also sanctions, which are really important, and also expansion of sanctions on Russian oligarchs, State Duma officials, embargo on all commodities from Russia, oil, gas. And actually now we are campaigning, collecting evidences of all Putin's, crime against humanity, because Putin will be stopped in Ukraine and then he will be punished. An international tribunal, this is what Putin, Lavrov, Shoigu, and all the killers who are now involved in this full-scale escalation against Ukraine. So
one of the people that you met was the US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken. Of these ideas that you've put forward, which did he agree to support?
So State Secretary Blinken mentioned embargo, that the US will stop buying Russian oil. Also tougher sanctions on Russian oligarchs, including Abramovich, Friedman, Deripaska, and all of them. And we hope to see more military assistance, because the US is a security guarantor of Ukraine when Ukraine gave up the third largest nuclear power in 1994.
You talked, though, about military assistance, more military assistance than maximum. What do you mean by that? Because a lot of countries have already offered armoury, hardware, but they don't want to get involved with the actual battle itself.
Let's be honest, Russian war against NATO already started. The battlefield is Ukraine. And today, you just reported about a Russian rocket strike on Yavoriv. It's a peacekeeping and security or military base in Western Ukraine. It's just 30 kilometers to Ukraine-Poland border. So isn't this is a signal that Putin will not stop in Ukraine? So this is why Ukrainian victory, geopolitically important to stop tyranny, authoritarian regimes, and not to allow another, like China, to follow Russia and behave in similar way in the Indo-Pacific region.
Hanna Hopko speaking to us earlier. People in the UK are to be offered £350 a month to take in Ukrainians who've fled the war. The British government has announced a Homes for Ukraine scheme starting this week. Here's our political correspondent, Ian Watson.
Stand with Ukraine! Stand with Ukraine!
At this demonstration outside Downing Street, there were calls for more weapons to be sent to Ukraine and more help for those fleeing the conflict.
I think that UK should allow more people to come and to stay here.
I would definitely like to see more help and support.
And soon you'll be able to offer help on your own doorstep. The government's launching a scheme this week which will pay you £350 a month to offer a Ukrainian refugee or family a room in your home or any other property you may own for the next 6 months.
It's the fastest way in which we can get people out of danger and into the United Kingdom. And it is the case already that whether it's through social media platforms or whether it's through charities and civil society, those connections are being made.
And John Sutherland has already been preparing his home in London for Ukrainian refugees.
While they're here, I try to make them as welcome as possible, try to make their life enjoyable and not stressful, and make them feel welcome.
More than 2 million people have fled Ukraine, and the government expects tens of thousands to come here as a result of its new scheme. Those who pass security checks will be able to stay for 3 years with the right to work and to most state benefits, as well as having access to public services. But there's pressure to do more. The government says it intends to extend its scheme to allow charities, churches and other organisations to bring in more refugees from Ukraine. But some Conservative MPs who've been pressing their own government to take a more generous approach still aren't impressed. One of them got in touch with me today to say he felt the new scheme was half-baked. And opposition parties say the government's overall response has been too strict and too slow. The Lib Dems are blaming the Home Secretary and want her sacked.
Priti Patel's inaction does not befit the British people with all our compassion and generosity. It couldn't be clearer that Priti Patel is not up to the job.
And the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales say they want to bring refugees in more quickly. So far, 3,000 UK visa applications have been granted. Labour broadly welcomed the new scheme, but criticised the government's record.
So far, I think the Home Office and the government's got it completely wrong. The scheme that they've put in place so far has been too slow, too narrow, too mean.
The government's providing humanitarian aid to help refugees close to Ukraine's border, but it says the success of its new scheme will depend on the generosity of the British people. Ian Watson, BBC News.
Let's hear now from the President of Poland, Andrzej Duda, whose country is front and centre of the Ukrainian refugee crisis, with more than 1.5 million people having crossed the borders since the start of the Russian invasion. My colleague Sophie Rayworth has been speaking to President Duda and began by asking him how concerned he was about the potential use of chemical weapons.
This is something the world has not seen on this scale since the Second World War. And if you're asking me whether Putin can use chemical weapons, I think that Putin can use anything right now, especially that he's in a very difficult situation. This is what most experts have been saying. Actually, politically, he has already lost this war, and militarily, he's not winning it. Although one could say there is a gigantic advantage of the Russian army over the Ukrainian army. If you take a piece of paper and if you do the maths, then they've got a crushing, overwhelming majority, but they are not able to win the war.
If President Putin did use chemical weapons, is that a red line for NATO? Is that a point at which NATO then has to get involved?
Well, of course, everybody hopes that he will not dare do that he will not use weapons of mass destruction, neither chemical weapons, nor biological weapons, nor any form of nuclear weapons. Everybody is hoping that this is not going to happen. But as we say in Poland, using a little bit of an English expression, if he uses any weapons of mass destruction, then this will be a game changer in the whole thing. And for sure, the North Atlantic Alliance and its leaders, led by the United States, will have to sit at the table and they will really have to think seriously what to do. Because then it starts to be dangerous, not only for Europe, not only for our part of Europe or our region, for Central Europe, but for the whole world.
You have got 28 jets, MiG jets, Soviet-era jets, that you want to give to Ukraine. Their pilots could fly them. What difference would it make to people in Ukraine, do you think, if they had those planes?
The issue of the jets which you have mentioned, of MiG-29s, which are at the disposal of the Polish armed forces, this is of course a very serious one, a very sensitive issue. There were various voices as to whether we should transfer or not transfer the jets. Speaking frankly, Polish public opinion was very much afraid of this step, because the Russian side made a very clear announcement that it would consider it a war declaration, And myself, looking from a perspective which I mentioned a moment ago as of our responsibility within NATO, always remember that these are powerful airplanes.
President Zelensky says this is about human lives. He says that he has asked once, he's asked again. He says we have to solve it faster and don't shift the responsibility. Send the planes to Ukraine. Why don't you just give them those planes now?
When you say you, I hope you mean the North Atlantic community. In other words, NATO as a whole, because, as I said, due to Allied responsibility, Poland as such is not going to transfer those planes on the basis of our own decision, because we believe that Allies could bear a grudge against us, at least if we make this decision, because potentially it could place the entire NATO in a difficult position in its relationship with Russia. But it is a very serious decision. Please bear in mind that President Volodymyr Zelensky and the Ukrainian authorities are in an extremely difficult situation. Of course, to me, it is obvious that they can have different demands and that they can have different expectations. Perhaps they can even air their grievances, and all that is justified. I want to say this right away. It is justified because they are fighting. They are fighting for freedom. They are fighting for survival. However, transferring planes, or President Zelensky demanding to establish a cupola or a shield defending the skies over Ukraine, so blocking the skies over Ukraine against the possibility of entering Ukraine airspace by Russian aircraft, combat aircraft, bombers or fighter jets. Well, this is a decision which is a strictly military one and a very serious one, because it means that NATO jets would have to be sent into Ukrainian airspace, and probably there would be a confrontation between NATO aircraft and Russian aircraft. And that would mean an opening, possibly, of the Third World War. So these are very serious decisions indeed.
And are you very confident, are you fully confident that if Russia did attack Poland, that NATO would back you, that NATO would defend you?
Madam, that's why we are members of the North Atlantic Alliance, and we are trying to be as credible a member as possible.
Because there are people in Poland, aren't there, who fear that President Putin won't stop at Ukraine, that President Putin could attack elsewhere, that they could attack Poland, and they are worried about whether NATO will defend them. Do you think there's any truth in their fears?
Pani redaktor,
Madam, in 2008 Russia attacked Georgia, and back then the President of the Republic of Poland was Professor Lech Kaczynski, and I was a minister in his chancellery here at the Presidential Palace. I served with him. President Kaczynski decided to take pressure off Central Europe on board of his plane and fly to Tbilisi, which was under threat, and there in Tbilisi he said the prophetic words. He said, "Today is Georgia, tomorrow it might be Ukraine, then the Baltic states, and after that a time may come for my country, for Poland." And he said that Russia had to be stopped because it had revived its imperial ambitions, which are dangerous. They are a dreadful danger to our part of Europe, and we do not want to be in the Russian sphere of influence. We were in that sphere of influence, we dragged ourselves out of it, and we never want to go back there again. Russia deprived us of our liberty many times. Russia murdered our citizens. Russia murdered us in captivity during the Second War. They murdered our officers and tried to eradicate the Polish intelligentsia here because they were a big part of the Polish intelligentsia. We know that Russia presents a deadly danger, irrespective if it is the Russia of the Tsars who partitioned Poland. There were 3 uprisings against the Tsarist Russia. Polish people shed blood. I was born in the Soviet sphere of influence in a state which was not fully sovereign, which was not fully free, and when somebody talks to me about Russian communism and socialism, shivers go down my spine. Never again do we want to have Soviet soldiers here, and never again do we want to have the Soviet sphere of influence here.
President Duda of Poland speaking to Sophie Rayworth. Chelsea have been in action in the past few hours for their first home game since Roman Abramovich was sanctioned by the UK government. Louisa Pilbeam is at the BBC Sports Centre.
Kai Havertz won the game for Chelsea in the 89th minute, their second win since news of economic sanctions threw their club's future into chaos. Roman Abramovich was sanctioned last week by the UK government, of course, meaning he cannot sell the club unless he gives the money to the...
Our live page on the BBC News website is continually updated with the latest developments on Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm Martine Croxall. Thanks for joining us.